What the Tortoise Said to Achilles by Lewis Carroll. Prologue by Don Quixote de la Mancha. Since it would be difficult to follow this short story without some introduction, I designed this prologue. The writer of the story, the mathematician Lewis Carroll, who is famous for his books Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking-Glass, continues the paradox of Zeno. This paradox, called Achilles and the Tortoise, preserved through the writings of Aristotle, deals with the following issue. Let's suppose that Achilles, the fastest runner of the Greeks, and a tortoise, one of the slowest animals known to man, meet for a friendly foot race. And because it is a friendly foot race, Achilles shows himself as a true sportsman and gives the tortoise a head start, knowing to be the fastest of them both. Zeno says that, under the premise that both run at constant speed, it's now impossible for Achilles to catch up with the tortoise. He claims that in the time that it takes to catch up the distance the tortoise had when Achilles started to run, the tortoise would again run a certain distance. Achilles would have to run even further, and again the tortoise would have time to develop its stance. The distance between them both would become smaller, yes, but Achilles would never be able to outrun the tortoise, since the distance could be divided infinitely. This is of course an illogical conclusion, proven wrong by the mere fact that although the division is infinite, the distance is not. Achilles would outrun the tortoise at a certain point and thereby win the race. That's the setting of the story. It does not further deal with the claims of Zeno, but rather of Aristotle's thoughts and what he wrote in the Organon about logic. In it, he states that you need for a conclusion called Z two true premises, A and B. For example, A. Human are mortal. B. Greeks are human. Therefore Z. Greeks are also mortal. If A or B or both are incorrect, then of course Z would also be incorrect. But if both are true, how could Z not also be true? Well, let's return to Achilles, who finally was able to outrun the tortoise, and therefore won the race. What the Tortoise Said to Achilles by Lewis Carroll. Achilles had overtaken the tortoise and had seated himself comfortably on its back. "So you've got to the end of our race course," said the tortoise, "even though it does consist of an infinite series of distances. I thought some wiseacre or other had proved that the thing couldn't be done." "It can be done," said Achilles. "It has been done, solvitur ambulando. You see, the distances were constantly diminishing, and so—" "But if they had been constantly increasing," the tortoise interrupted, "how then?" "Then I shouldn't be here," Achilles modestly replied, "and you would have got several times around the world by this time." "You flatter me." "Flatten, I mean," said the tortoise, "for you are a heavy weight, and no mistake. Well now, would you like to hear the race course that most people fancy that they can get to the end of in 2 or 3 steps, while it really consists of an infinite number of distances, each one longer than the previous one?" "Very much indeed," said the Grecian warrior, as he drew from his helmet — few Grecian warriors possessed pockets in those days — an enormous notebook and a pencil. "Proceed, and speak slowly, please. Shorthand isn't invented yet." "That beautiful first proposition of Euclid," the tortoise murmured dreamily. "You admire Euclid?" "Passionately. So far, at least, as one can admire a treatise that won't be published for some centuries to come." "Well now, let's take a little bit of the argument of the first proposition. Just 2 steps, and the conclusion drawn from them. Kindly enter them in your notebook. And in order to refer to them conveniently, let's call them A, B, and Z. A. Things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. B. The 2 sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. Z. The 2 sides of this triangle are equal to each other. Readers of Euclid will grant, I suppose, that Z follows logically from A and B, so that anyone who accepts A and B as true must accept Z as true. Undoubtedly, The youngest child in a high school, as soon as high schools are invented, which will not be till some 2000 years later, will grant that. And if some readers had not yet accepted A and B as true, he might still accept the sequence as a valid one, I suppose. No doubt such a reader might exist. He might say, I accept as true the hypothetical proposition that if A and B be true, Z must be true. But I don't accept A and B as true. Such a reader would do wisely in abandoning Euclid and taking to football. And might there not also be some reader who would say, I accept A and B as true, but I don't accept the hypothetical? Certainly there might be. He also had better to take to football. And neither of these readers, the Tortoise continued, is as yet under any logical necessity to accept Z as true. Quite so, Achilles assented. Well, now I want you to consider me as a reader of the second kind, and to force me, logically, to accept Z as true. A tortoise playing football would be, Achilles was beginning. An anomaly, of course, the Tortoise hastily interrupted. Don't wander from the point. Let's have Z first and football afterwards. I'm to force you to accept Z, am I? Achilles said musingly. And your present position is that you accept A and B, but you don't accept the hypothetical. Let's call it Z, said the Tortoise. But you don't accept Z. If A and B are true, Z must be true. That is my present position, said the Tortoise. Then I must ask you to accept Z. I'll do so, said the Tortoise, as soon as you've entered it in that notebook of yours. What else have you got in it? Only a few memoranda, said Achilles, nervously fluttering the leaves. A few memoranda of the battles in which I have distinguished myself. Plenty of blank leaves, I see, the Tortoise cheerily remarked. We shall need them all. Achilles shuddered. Now write as I dictate. A. Things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. B. The two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. Z. If A and B are true, Z must be true. Z. The two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. You should call it D, not Z, said Achilles. It comes next to the other three. If you accept A and B and Z, you must accept Z. And why must I? Because it follows logically from them. If A and B and Z are true, Z must be true. You don't dispute that, I imagine. A and B and Z are true, Z must be true, the Tortoise thoughtfully repeated. That's another hypothetical, isn't it? And if I fail to see its truth, I might accept A and B and Z, and still not accept Z, mightn't I? You might, the candid hero admitted. Through such obtuseness would certainly be phenomenal. Still, the event is possible. So I must ask you to grant one more hypothetical. Very good. I'm quite willing to grant it as soon as you've written it down. We will call it D. If A and B and Z are true, then Z must be true. Have you entered that in your notebook? I have! Achilles joyfully exclaimed as he ran the pencil into its sheath. And at last we've got to the end of this ideal race course. Now that you accept A and B and Z and D, of course you accept Z. Do I? Said the Tortoise innocently. Let's make that quite clear. I accept A and B and Z and D. Suppose I still refuse to accept Z. Then logic would take you by the throat and force you to do it, Achilles triumphantly replied. Logic would tell you you can't help yourself. Now that you've accepted A and B and Z and D, you must accept Z. So you have no choice, you see? Whatever logic is good enough to tell me is worth writing down, said the Tortoise. So end it in your book, please. We will call it E. If A and B and Z and D are true, Z must be true. Until I have granted that, of course, I needn't grant Z. So it's quite a necessary step, you see. I see, said Achilles, and there was a touch of sadness in his tone. Here the narrator, having pressing business at the bank, was obliged to leave the happy pair, and did not again pass the spot until some months afterwards. When he did so, Achilles was still seated on the back of a much enduring tortoise, and was writing in his notebook, which appeared to be nearly full. The tortoise was saying, "Have you got the last step written down? Unless I've lost count, that makes 1,001. There are several millions more to come. And would you mind, as a personal favor, considering what a lot of instruction this colloquy of ours will provide for the logicians of the 19th century, would you mind adopting a pun that my cousin the Mock Turtle will then make, and allowing yourself to be renamed Tortoise?" "As you please," replied the wary warrior, in the hollow tones of despair as he buried his face in his hands, "provided that you, for your part, will adopt a pun the Mock Turtle never made, and allow yourself to be renamed Achilles."